Hello everyone and welcome to today's side event on powering past gas, the role of public finance for a just energy transition. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are logging in from. My name is Jacqueline Kimeu. I work for Access Coalition and I will be your moderator for the next 1.5 hours. Today's panel, we are going to public finance and also looking at how this, what this means for Africa. Before I deep dive on the panelists, I want to give a few housekeeping issues. First and foremost, we are going to have questions at the end of the panel. And also, when you want to ask a question, please unmute yourself, introduce yourself, then I will call upon you to give a brief, introduction or rather your comment or question. After that, we'll go to the panelists. They will give a quick overview, quick remarks about the topic of the day. And then after that, we will go straight to questions and answers. Before we start, I also want to highlight, give a brief introduction about our panelists. Today, we are honored to have, panelists with a great experience in this sector. And first of all, we have Dr. John Malton. John is a UK's COP26 envoy. Most recently, he served as Her Majesty's ambassador to the Democratic Republic of Congo and also Central African Republic. John has experience in Africa and also in Asia, and his previous appointments have included Deputy High Commissioner at the British High Commission in Nairobi, UK Permanent Representative to the UN to the UN in Kenya, the UK High Commissioner to Mauritius, and also the Ambassador to Madagascar. Second, we have Lucille Dufour. Lucille is a Senior Policy Advisor at IISD Energy Program. Her work focuses on fossil fuel support, including the impact of COVID-19 recovery responses on energy transition, fossil fuel subsidy reform, and also shifting international public finance from fossil fuels to clean energy. We also have Paul Kunert, who has huge experience running over 25 years experience, working in energy infrastructure, mostly of which has been in Africa, working with CDC, GlobelEq, Actis, and also others. And his work has been on oil and gas, hydroelectric, and also solar and wind projects. Again, we have Promise Salawu. He's a young activist working with young people and grassroots communities in Nigeria. He presently works with Tearfund as a project officer, and he oversees 7 environmental and economic projects by Tearfund and partners in Ghana, covering issues to do with waste management, renewable energy, and also climate-smart agriculture. Finally, we have Elizabeth Wanja from Kenya Climate Change Working Group. As a coordinator, he coordinates multi-stakeholder groups to implement clean energy and climate change projects at the county, national, and also at the global levels. She has experience in project management, community mobilization, and also conducting grassroots training on climate change. So today, I'm really excited about the announcement that was made yesterday on ending support for fossil fuel globally and also specifically in Africa. Yesterday, we saw a range of stakeholders, governments committing to ending fossil fuels, notably 20 countries, including US, UK, and also Canada and Italy. So the commitment is welcome because this is what we have been waiting for a long time. And it's a high time that we move this to action on the ground and ensure that public support goes to renewable energy financing, and especially in countries that are most affected. Currently, we have over 700 million people in Africa lacking access to energy, electricity for that matter. Previously, we have seen a lot of financing going to fossil fuels and really a limited amount of funding going to renewable energy. This announcement that was made yesterday is very critical for us, and we are happy that COP26 has actually come out with this kind of an announcement that will help us in terms of moving forward on renewable energy financing. So at this juncture, I would like to invite my panelists to give a few remarks about their feelings, their comments on the topic of our day. And I will start with John Martin. Please welcome.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, and it's a pleasure to be here with a virtual audience, which is rather strange of us, for those of us in the studio. Look, I'm really excited about where we've got to yesterday with the announcement that was made on fossil fuel finance. And it's the culmination of a lot of work by a lot of dedicated public servants in the UK and beyond. You mentioned that I'd been working in Kenya and then in DRC. I've spent half my professional life in Africa, and it's long been a source of frustration to me to see households in poverty unable to access energy, girls unable to study at night because there was no light in the house, and the sort of poverty that flows from that, and the inability of people without access to energy to really engage in the economy and improve their livelihoods. And it was always a frustration for me, working in Kenya, for example, with GlobelEq and others, to see that it was really quite easy to raise export credits or public finance and guarantees to support investment in the oil and gas sector, but it was really rather hard to get the same finance to bring to bear in investment in renewables. And there seemed to me a contradiction between where we were in terms of our climate policy, where we would go in and lobby governments around the world to reduce their emissions and to set more ambitious long-term targets and NDCs, and what we were able to bring to bear in terms of our public finance to support countries in terms of making those kind of commitments. But what's been really exciting over the last few years is we've seen a huge technological development. And things like solar farms or wind farms have moved from being, if you like, innovative and exciting to dull and boring. And that's a really good change in terms of arranging finance. And that's been a really helpful thing. And the pressure on us from civil society, from groups like Tearfund and others, to make sure that what we did in practice with our finance matched up with what we did in our policy has been really helpful in pushing government along. So it was hugely exciting for me in March this year, when the UK government was able to commit to ending immediately all support for fossil fuels overseas, all public support for fossil fuels overseas. And that's a policy that was hard won in the UK, and it means that we can't use export credits to support investments in fossil fuels overseas. It means our development assistance can't be targeted at fossil fuels. It means our diplomatic lobbying can't be in support of fossil fuels. And it's really changed the way we do energy diplomacy overseas, particularly in emerging markets. And now we've been able, in the last 6 months, to work to broaden out that coalition. And the economics of renewables have been behind us in this respect. It's made our job easier. Last year, 90% of energy capacity additions to the global grid were in wind and solar. So, renewables are becoming mainstream and serious money is getting behind it. And it meant we were able to argue coherently internationally that this was the future. We all take climate change very seriously. We know that climate change is going to hit the poorest people in the poorest countries the hardest, and it was right of us to stop using public funds to support investment in fossil fuels, but rather to invest it in renewable energy. So where we got to yesterday was that 25 countries and organisations have signed up to ending support for fossil fuels, public support for fossil fuels internationally by the end of 2022, including the USA, including Canada, including Italy, and countries that we might never have thought would have made this commitment back in the start of the year. So we've moved the debate a really long way, and we're rapidly getting to a stage where countries are saying, actually, rather than being afraid to move and change in this direction, they're rather worried they'll be left out, and they're struggling to catch up. So we're in an exciting place, and it means that with the countries that signed up yesterday, $18 billion a year that was used on average over the last 6 years to support fossil fuels overseas will now be able to be used towards renewable energy. And that gives me hope, not just in terms of our climate change agenda, but it gives me confidence that actually we will be able to reach communities that might never have been reached by a traditional electrical infrastructure with thermal power stations and a grid, but now can be reached through the use of renewables and batteries and solar to sort of generate mini grids in the most remote villages, in places I presume you're Kenyan, in the most remote places in Turkana or Marsabit, in Congo, in other countries, Nigeria, you will be able to reach communities with mini grids that would never be reached by the grid. So we're in an exciting place.
Great. Thank you very much for that, and also to UK for being a front runner when it comes to shifting from funding fossil fuels to, renewable energy. And happy that most of some countries in the global south where these challenges are actually the highest have been able also to sign into this. So hopefully we'll have more countries signing in by, the end of the year and also in the years to come. So,
if I may just add, it's really important as well that we have countries from the global south signing and putting their hands up and saying, actually, we don't want the investment in fossil fuels. We know that's going to be a stranded asset in the future. Yeah. We want investments in renewables, and that's just as important as the donors saying that we're going to shift our funding from fossil fuels to renewables.
Oh, great. That's why CSOs like us are going to work with governments in the global south to ensure that this happens and we all move in the same direction in terms of financing renewable energy resources. So I come to you, Promise, having worked in Nigeria, working where gas issues are actually one of the key issues. Would you please tell us briefly about your feelings about that, remarks in short? Yeah.
Thank you so much for the privilege. It's interesting to be in this conversation because just very recently, the Nigerian president made our declarations to say gas will be one of the transitional fuel for Nigeria, moving away from fossil fuel. Nigeria has huge resources when it comes to gas, and Nigeria is about the 7th largest in terms of gas reservoir globally. And this cannot be pushed aside. We cannot ignore the fact that we have a huge possibility also in gas. It's interesting to see that we're beginning to make deliberate effort to move away from fossil fuel and just for a balance use gas in that process, right? It's also very important to note that recently, 2008, Nigeria developed a master plan for the use of gas in the country. Of course, this helps to localize gas for most importantly for cooking, and then this also has gone a long way to show the gas pricing, framework, and more importantly, a good food blueprint for gas to work within the country and for exports outside the country. And because of this, it's very critical to look at the idea behind having gas now and also look at the relationship between gas and renewable energy. For some of us, my work in Tearfund has shown that you could actually solve one problem and then solve multiple problems as you solve that one problem. So we say we use one stone to kill two birds, isn't it? So take, for example, when we talk about renewable energy, one of the things that comes out clearly beyond the solving of power problem in Nigeria is the fact that there's a huge demography of young people in Nigeria who are unengaged, who are unemployed. I'm looking at the history of oil and gas. We see very clearly that oil and gas only employ about 1% of the entire workforce of the Nigerian population. Now, if we compare that with what is possible with renewable energy, you find out that it scales up hugely larger than what we are looking at right now. And so for some of us, we feel that it's a welcome idea. It's a beautiful idea to actually begin to look at those parts. But at the same time, because beyond solving the problem of climate change, we know that climate change is about human beings. It's deeper than just the issues. It affects the human life, right? We cannot ignore the relationships that this is going to affect. So we're saying in essence that it's a beautiful idea. But beyond just having that gas line, we also need to begin to deliberately think about how to deal with the issue of poverty, how to deal with the issue of equity, how to bring the possibilities that dwell largely in renewable energy. And it will interest you to know that Nigeria also has a huge, particularly for solar, has a huge potential for solar. Recently we found out that we could have access to as much as 457,000 megawatts of power just from solar. That's amazing. Compared to the kind of infrastructures that we need to set up for gas, looking at the realities on ground that, yes, there are systems on ground, there are a few infrastructures, but beyond that is the fact that those infrastructures in the nearest future might not really be worth it, isn't it? Because everybody's moving away from that system. But of course, for a transitional period, which some of us hope will not be so long, will give us an opportunity to stabilize before we begin to do greater investment in renewable energy. For me, I also think that it gives us an opportunity to have great innovations. We have beautiful young people with great minds in Nigeria, people creating beautiful technology. I think that it's also an opportunity to develop indigenous technology. When we talk about renewable energy, it's an opportunity to develop indigenous technology. We cannot run away from the need for financing when it comes to renewable energy. And look, everybody's moving away from fossil fuel, from gas, but it also presents Nigeria an opportunity. Now that we have more people looking out for renewable energy, we can showcase what we have. We have brilliant young people who are creating beautiful technologies. These technologies will need seed funding. And that's why we are looking forward to having investors work with us, work with the grassroots NGOs who are seeing the beautiful creation of these young Nigerians. I think it's a beautiful idea. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Promise. Indeed, it's doable, and we are looking forward to seeing how young people in Nigeria, working with the other stakeholders, can transform the sector, and also looking into issues of is gas, the ideal fuel for transition, really. Yeah. So we're looking forward to how the future unfolds. But with yesterday's announcement, I'm happy that we are moving in the right direction. Yeah. I want to go to Lucille Dufresne. Given your extensive experience in the fossil fuel industry, working on policy issues around, fossil fuel, what are your quick remarks about, the sector?
Thanks very much, and I'm already really inspired by the two interventions that I've heard. At ISD, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, we've been looking this year into the role of gas and gas finance in the Global South. And we've released a report called Step Off the Gas earlier in June that really looks into these issues. And I'd like to share some of the key findings with you, because I think that they are quite clear in terms of what's the future of gas finance in the Global South. Maybe we can put the slides on. Thank you very much. All right, so the first thing that we wanted to look into when we put together this report is the trends of international public finance going into gas. And as you see on the chart that you can see on the screen, the findings are quite striking. What we found is that gas received, on average, every year between 2017 and 2019, about $16 billion. And this is 4 times as much as overseas investments in wind or solar. And when you look at the graph, you can see that the gas bar of the graph is much bigger than any of the other ones. So there's clearly something that we need to think about here, and something that is extremely problematic, because obviously this investment, this public finance flowing into developing countries, into gas projects, can have dire consequences, both for the global climate and also for the economies of countries in the Global South. Which leads me to the second finding, and we really wanted to look into what are the climate implications of this international public support to gas, and also the economic implications. So here you can see a graph that looks at the gas uses globally, and the current trajectories, but I also would like to make a point that is about production, because I think that the latest report that we've seen, and the latest energy trajectory scenarios that we've seen, including the one from the International Energy Agency's the net zero scenario, really shows that there is no more room for more gas production. And if we want to wind down gas production, obviously public finance needs to decrease accordingly. No, when it comes to gas use globally, what you can see on the graph is that in 1.5 compatible scenarios, and here you can see the ones from the IPCC, there is a steep decline in gas use over the next decades. However, the current trajectory is still upwards. That means that, you know, when countries and governments are going to go through, because of the climate imperative, this decline in gas use, it's going to, and production, it's going to affect the entire gas value chain, and it's going to expose countries in the global south to risks of stranded assets if we invest in new gas infrastructure. So there's a real risk here that needs to be tackled, just so that we don't imperil the economies in the global south that are actually still trying to meet their development needs. Which then leads me to the question that we asked ourselves: do we actually need gas investments in the global south? And the response is, in most cases, we don't. What we looked at is the clean energy alternatives that are already available and that are already cost competitive to replace gas in the global south. And you can see on the right hand of the slide, and sorry, this is a very complex chart, but you can look at it more into details in our report. But what we found is that for most of the uses, and especially the biggest uses of energy in the global south, including power generation and heating, clean energy alternatives are already cost competitive for gas uses, which means that there is no economic rationale to invest into gas. And for the industries that for which we don't have cost competitive alternatives yet, and it includes in particular the heavy industry, alternatives will become, because of technological progress, competitive in the next decade at the latest. So there's really a rationale here not to invest in further gas projects, so that we don't get into a lock-in for decades when alternatives are already getting cheaper. And obviously, I think we will have time to discuss it in the discussion as well, but in many instances as well, clean alternatives are better suited to respond to the electricity access needs and to the clean cooking needs in the global south, but we can come back to that. The final point that I wanted to make is that obviously there are challenges in deploying clean energy alternatives in the global south, but this is exactly where we think that there is a role for international public finance in terms of delivering energy on energy access needs, de-risking private investments, enabling green integration, technology transfer, and also supporting a just transition. And this is where this public support will be the most efficient, and not in terms of locking in, you know, countries in the global south into high carbon pathway. Maybe to conclude, I think that our report is quite clear that there is no economic or climate rationale to invest more public funds at the international level into gas. And that there needs to be an urgent shift away from fossil fuels and into clean alternatives. And I think this is exactly the purpose of the statement that was launched yesterday. And this is why we really welcome it at civil society, but we also hope that there will be a quick delivery on the commitment and a bold delivery to make sure that this shift happens as fast as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucille, for that good findings from your research. And indeed, a bit to note that, yes, renewables are the cheapest option, yet a lot of money is not going to them. And also, what is needed in terms of public finance, where money should go to in terms of supporting grid connection, energy transition, and others. With that, I come to you, Paul Kunert. Please give us your quick remarks about public finance in the sector.
Sure, thank you. So, yeah, what to say in addition to what's been said already? At a headline, I think solving climate change is in some ways a really simple thing to do. We need to stop burning fossil fuels as soon as we possibly can. But of course, because we've built much of our current prosperity on fossil fuels, that's also a hard thing to do. to unwind that and to replace that and go through a transition of energy use now from coal, oil and gas to renewable energies is a simple concept to understand, but a tough one to put into practice. I think a second component of this is around the where fossil fuels are produced and where they're used. They can very often be produced in countries that are in emerging markets like Africa, but they're very frequently used in the more developed countries. So there's a real challenge around managing that. And actually, I very much welcome the achievement of getting 25 governments and institutions to sign up to say we're not going to fund new oil and gas projects. That's a huge step forward, and I think, if I understand it correctly, that I think means that there's going to be no new investment in the production of coal, oil and gas by the UK government or by the other 25 that are signed up to that. That is a huge step forward. What happens on the ground in terms of providing reliable electricity to everybody in emerging markets is a slightly different question. We've heard from Promise that gas remains part of the story in Nigeria and will do for some time. It may be the case that there are reasons to continue to invest in gas-fired power stations, perhaps running on existing reserves that are already in production elsewhere. But I wonder if the time for that kind of gas as a transition fuel is actually past now. I worked in Africa in developing gas-fired power stations. I spent 5 years of my working life in Tanzania, developing and then constructing and then bringing into operation as a gas-fired power station. It was about 150 megawatts, and that was providing the backbone of Tanzania's energy for the next decade. But 150 megawatts is tiny. So, yeah, in global terms, the UK's grid at that time was 80,000 megawatts. What I think I'm trying to say there is it may not matter that much if Africa continues to use gas for a little while. What really does matter is what developing countries do to get off the gas that we're burning. And a final comment from me as an investor is that I respond to the rules that are set in the market. It's really, really simple to have investors change behaviours. It's simply to change the rules about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's incentivised, what's not incentivised. In the UK, it's really easy to change investor behaviour into renewable energies and others by setting policy and setting incentives right. The same thing is true for investors looking to invest in Nigeria or Kenya or Sierra Leone or all the other places I've been trying to invest for the last 20 years. If you set a policy that says we're having renewables, that's what I'll do, that's what I'll pursue. If you set a policy saying gas is acceptable, we'll still pursue that, investors will pursue that. If you say coal's acceptable, we'll continue to do that. So if you want to change investor behaviour, it's simply change the rules. And we saw that with coal in across emerging markets when, first of all, development agencies like DEG and FMO and CDC said, we're not funding any more coal projects. And we started to think, well, maybe we shouldn't be developing coal projects because the funding probably won't be there, or maybe we can get it from India or China or elsewhere. But actually it just became too difficult. So we stopped developing them, even though nobody had set a hard and fast rule. They just said, we're not financing that kind of stuff anymore. I think the same thing can be true for gas. Let's be saying actually the window is closing for gas-fired power plants. Do you really want to spend the next 3 years working on something, developing this project, getting it all market ready, only to find that actually investors moved on in 3 years' time? That loophole that exists today, won't be there in 3 years' time. Let's move on from saying gas is a transition fuel, and let's start picking up those alternatives that Lucille was talking about. I genuinely believe we can move on from gas very quickly if we choose to do that. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you very much, Paul, for those remarks. Indeed, gas is not the solution. And having worked in Africa, you know the challenges that have been experienced, and you know we can transition to, cleaner fuels. With that, I go to you, Elizabeth Wanja from Kenya. Given the nexus between energy and poverty, energy access and energy transition, please give us your quick remarks about, public finance. Yeah.
Thanks, Jackie, and thanks for having me. It's great listening to my fellow speakers. They've given very interesting highlights. First, allow me to paint a picture of the energy situation in the region. The Sub-Saharan Africa is the region that is lowest in terms of energy access, with only half of the population having access to electricity and a third having access to clean cooking. In terms of numbers, about 600 million lack access to electricity, and another 890 million still rely on traditional traditional biomass for cooking. Again, urbanization is also happening at a very precedented rates and also scale. This means that there is increased demand for energy, be it in terms of industrialization, be it in terms of cooking, be it in terms of mobility, among other uses of energy. Again, population growth in the region is happening at a very high rate, and this further exerts pressure on an energy system that is already struggling to meet the energy demands of the current population. In addition, the region has a very low or little installed capacity, which means that the consumption is also very low and also access is low. This translates to low per capita, low GDP per capita and less development. And the irony of all this is that Sub-Saharan Africa is richly endorsed in terms of the renewable energy resources, but unfortunately these have not been exploited to full potential. Sorry, I have a cold. And this really affects the region in terms of economic development and sustainable growth. So what are the energy needs of the continent? One, we need energy for cooking, just like I mentioned. The region is suffering from a lack of access to energy. Our women, our young girls are dying in the kitchen due to using dirty fuels, so the kitchens are smoky. We have increased cases of diseases associated with respiratory infections. We have the associated drudgery, and this negatively impacts the women and the young girls. Again, most of these countries in the region have very limited comprehensive strategies in terms of cooking, and even for those countries that these strategies are in place, they are not well funded, which means that even the foreseen gains that were to be realized are not realized, and thus affecting the region. But luckily, there is still progress that is happening. Like in Kenya, we have a utility company, KPLC, setting up a modern kitchen demonstration whereby they are advocating for use of electricity for cooking. And this is something that very few people can relate with. The perception out there is that electricity is expensive. And for us, we say seeing is believing. So when it comes to advocating for the use of clean fuels like electricity for cooking, people have to see, people have to smell, people have to taste the food to appreciate that indeed the quality of food, the taste of food, and the color of food will remain the same as when cooked using their normal cooking models of cooking. And we've seen this working, but there is still need for a lot of awareness creation, a lot of capacity building for us to be able to create that demand for use of such technologies. Again, we need energy to power our agriculture sector. We understand that most of these countries in the region have agriculture as their main source of livelihoods, and this is an area that is highly sensitive to climate change. And with access to energy, we are able to solarize our pumps, we are able to process our crops, we are able to process our farm produce, and this helps us in terms of minimizing the losses associated with post-harvest losses, if I may put it that way. Again, we need energy to run our institutions of learning. We need energy for education. We need energy to enable our children to have elongated hours of study. We need energy to have our children being that general well-being so that they're able to even excel in schools. We need energy to power our health systems, especially for the last mile communities who are now our first mile communities. We need energy to power the dispensaries, especially at the very grassroots level. These are areas which are not connected to the grid. They're underserved, they're unserved. And so with decentralized renewable energy, we're able to reach such communities. And with that, our women will be able to deliver at any time of the day. Our children will be able to access vaccines at any time of the day. And now in the COVID era, we are going to be able to store these COVID vaccines and therefore reduce the number of deaths that could be associated with lack of access to these vaccines, and also limiting the amount of distance that people will need to travel in terms of accessing these vaccines. We also need energy to power the economy generally, just to have green jobs, to have elongated hours in terms of business, because in most cases, especially in the region, we have by 7 it's already dark, so our small-scale traders are forced to close their shops early. But if we have access to energy, especially for the solar masts, we'll be able to have longer trading hours and therefore improve livelihoods at even the household level. So what do we want to do differently? One, we are calling on our governments to increase their profiles, to increase their ambitions in terms of cooking. And this will not only help them to realize their targets, but also attract external investments in terms of, or funding in terms of energy. And a case in point is Kenya. We're able to increase our ambition to access to universal cooking for all by 2028. And with this, we've been able to even attract financing from GCF, which is currently supporting a program on clean cooking. And we are seeing the transformation that this has brought about. We are also calling on governments and also development partners to put in place the right policies and investment plans that commensurate to the massive energy demands of the continent. We are also calling for gender mainstreaming and just adding the voices of the young, of all the sectors of the community, especially the marginalized communities, to ensure that they form part of the energy conversation. And with this, we are calling for inclusion of women in the energy value chains, in the energy policy making processes, in the energy budgeting, to ensure that the women bring in the voices, since they are the ones who especially at the household level, they are tasked in terms of biomass fuel provision. We want to engage women as champions. We want to engage women as entrepreneurs, and also to engage women as agents of behavior change in the community. We are also calling on We're also calling on communities to appreciate or uptake these existing technologies in terms of linking, especially when you're linking this with their social economics livelihoods. Like where I come from, we have the Maasais. We have very innovative projects that are currently installing wildlife deterring lights in the homesteads. And this has brought about a great change in terms of limited numbers of instances of wildlife attacking the livestock. And with this, we are seeing the communities appreciating that, yes, the renewable energy is the way to go. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you.
Very much, Elizabeth, for painting the picture on why energy access should be a critical part of energy transition, and especially in Sub-Saharan Africa. So with that, I now welcome comments and questions from our online participants. If you have a question, please raise your hand and unmute yourself, introduce yourself as well from where you're calling from. As we wait for that, we can just take a few questions from the panelists. So you've done a good job in painting the picture on why public finance should go to renewable energy. And with that, I want to come to you again, Dr. John Martin, on the announcement that was made yesterday, so set up the commitment for the countries. What are the next steps in terms of implementation? We know that, yes, we have countries have made commitments. UK has also made commitment yesterday, which we believe and we know it's a right step in the right direction. What are your thoughts on implementation of the commitment that was made yesterday?
Well, implementation will be for every respective government or organisation to take forward on by themselves. Actually, the declaration that we made yesterday is only a reflection of a commitment that the UK made back in March this year, and which we chose to implement immediately. And that meant that any projects that had not sort of reached legal close, where we were obliged to put financing in, were therefore sort of no longer eligible for finance. The declaration we made yesterday was for countries to make this switch by the end of 2022. Some people might say that's a little bit long, others will say that's a very ambitious target, because there's usually a pipeline of projects that countries have for their export credit agencies or for their development agencies to support. So it gives a little bit of time for some of those agencies to develop a new pipeline, but our experience is that that will happen remarkably quickly. In the UK, when we made that switch from the existing policy to our new policy back in March this year, our export credit agency had doubts about how quickly they'd be able to stand up a pipeline of new projects. And 6 months later, I speak to the head of the export credit agency, and he says, you know what? Our doubts were ill-founded. We've been able to stand up this fantastic new pipeline of renewable energy projects. There is the demand for it out there, and hopefully, you know, what we've decided to do and what was announced yesterday as a part of a broader partnership will really change the dial. I was noticing the graph that you were showed earlier, which showed that I think it was about $14 million were going annually to gas over the last few years, and about another $4 million was going to oil and gas. So all of that financing, $18 billion worth, sorry, will essentially now move away and into renewable energy. And I don't think it'll stop there, because I'm pretty confident that over the next few days, it won't just be the 25 countries that we had signed up, but there'll be more countries get on board as suddenly they realize this is the direction of travel. And our experience has been that actually change can happen far more quickly than we might have thought possible even just a few months ago.
Yeah, interesting. We hope that change happens very fast, so that we can transition to that. We have a few questions also for the panelists that came out before the meeting. So to you, Lucille, I want to ask a quick question in terms of given your experience on what you have been working in the public finance sector, and also given yesterday's announcement, what are the major countries and institutions that were missing from yesterday's list, and which would you like to see sign in, given what you have actually shown us today? Which are some of the countries that you think need to sign into this?
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really good question. And first, I think that I agree about the fact that it's already a huge breakthrough, that these 25 countries were able to commit. And I think that a few weeks or months ago, we would never have believed that these countries would be in a position to commit to end the international public finance, not only to coal, but also to oil and gas. And I think it's a huge, massive announcement. And obviously, you said earlier that these countries cover about 18 billion in fossil fuel finance per year. And data from Oil Change International says that overall, G20 country spends still a bit more than 63 billion on average per year. So we're a bit below 1/3 of all international public finance getting into fossil fuels. So obviously there is still much to be done to make sure that others join the group. I would say that the elephant in the room is that some of the laggards that were still funding coal a few months ago, that have committed really recently and are still heavily funding oil and gas, are still not in this group, including some Asian governments from Japan, Korea, China. These are big providers of international public finance for fossil fuels, between 8 and 10 billion USD per year. So we really need to see the shift in these regions as well. Also because in these regions, there is an urgent shift to be done towards clean energy. So I would say that this is potentially the next frontier, and we hope that the progressive governments and institutions that are now in the group of first movers will be able to set up dialogues with these governments that are still not quite there. Another point that I wanted to make is that we have a lot of countries and institutions from Europe that have joined the statement yesterday, but still some of them are still not there, including Germany, including France, including the Netherlands, and Europe has, I think the European Union and European countries have tried to lead the way in climate finance and shifting finance in the past years. So we would expect these countries to be part of the statement sooner rather than later. Last point maybe is I think it's really important to keep a balance in the membership and in the signatories to make sure that the Global South is rightly represented, because you don't shift finance from fossil fuels to clean energy without making sure that there's ownership of this statement and initiative and the way it has to be done. So I think it's a really key point to remember, to make sure that it's done in a way that responds to the need of countries in the Global South.
Great, thank you very much for that. I promise to you a question for you from our participants, from the perspective of Nigeria that you have really given us on, and with the background on a lot of reliance on the fossil fuels. Could you please give us the government perspective on such a shift, and what that would mean for jobs in the country if public finance makes this shift?
The Nigerian government believes that investing in gas right now is the most reasonable way forward. I think that's partly because what we have right now is gas, right? That's the raw material that we have at the moment. But I also believe that it's going towards the same path with the whole idea of crude oil, because it's very similar. They are not very far from each other, and that path does not really give opportunity for jobs. And for people like us, that's the border. That's those are the conversations we are having. The opportunities for jobs will most likely be greater from a point of view of renewable energy. Take for example, so public finance in gas now, I don't think it will change much. It wouldn't really change the whole thing around job opportunities. Take for example, I don't think it will. I don't think it will, because it's a pathway which already exists. We just need to invest money in infrastructures. I don't think in building infrastructures will create the kind of job opportunities that we're looking out for. So yes, public finance in this shift for gas, right, might not really change much when it comes to jobs. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
It's not like.
To you, Paul, having worked in Africa extensively, and the energy and poverty challenges in the continent, what do you think about investment in the DFI investment in Africa in terms of gas, and also is it the solution for tackling poverty really in Africa?
Great, thank you. DFI funding, I think, is one of the main sources of funding for big projects in Africa. So without a doubt, what DFIs decide to do, whether it's the World Bank or IFC or the UK's CDC or the European equivalents of that, what they decide to do and what they will decide to support is hugely important for what happens. And that's why the announcement's so important. I think we should also remember, though, that the DFIs aren't the only source of financing. So, I'm thinking about what's happened in solar and wind in two of the biggest markets in Africa. One is Egypt, and the other is South Africa. Both of those countries put out a pretty well-structured program, and almost all the projects that have been built have been funded by private sector money. So, whilst it's important that that the DFIs, have made this move away from funding fossil fuels, they're not the only funders of projects in Africa, and they're not the only funders of projects globally. I think that's what I was trying to articulate before, whilst it's important to turn off the tap of finance with public financing, it's also important to encourage the change of rules in the countries. And each one has to develop its own policy. So South Africa desperately needs to develop a policy that doesn't rely on new coal-fired power stations. I think they've had a bit of a disaster with the two they've tried to build more recently, and actually the renewable energy feed-in tariff program that's been there has been very successful. South Africa should be doing a lot more of that and really incentivizing the growth of that renewable energy program. Similarly, Egypt, also one of the biggest carbon sinners in terms of its electricity generation sector, also has huge wind and solar opportunities. They should be rolling that out, and we should be supporting government assistance from the UK or whatever. It should be spent around structuring those programs and really scaling them up. So yes, public finance is really important, but it's not the only tool, and it's not the only thing. The second thing I wanted to say is that actually the renewable energy technologies are really providing the opportunity for reaching the off-grid, the smaller towns and villages that are off-grid in Africa. There hasn't been a solution for that until container-based solar solutions that are community level, maybe connect 200 households in a small town or village. That's a new opportunity, and that's really exciting. That just hasn't been available before. So there's a huge opportunity for enormously increasing the kind of energy access that John was talking about right at the beginning, where where children can have a light bulb to do their homework in the evening, or you can run small businesses, or you can power the local health centre. That's a massive new opportunity that comes with this new technology. And since it's become now a boring technology, that can just be rolled out. Getting financing behind those kind of projects to make them more affordable than they are at the moment is a massive opportunity for public finance. And one final thing is just to say that on the, let me give you an example of a grid system that is running almost all on renewable energy in Africa. And it's the East African grid, where it's connected. So Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda, the three bigger ones in that. Tanzania is not really connected to that, but it could be. And that is running on a combination of hydro and geothermal and wind and solar, almost exclusively. And that's a large area of Africa. That's one of the main population centres. I think that's really exciting as a model. That can be scaled up and developed in that region, and it's an example for Nigeria and Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and Sierra Leone and Liberia on the west side as well, and for Central Africa, and for South Africa, and for Egypt. It can be done, it is being done, and those are some of the best grids in Africa, in East Africa. So there's a real actually being done example of how it can be done.
If I might just come in on something that Paul said, the money from the private sector is hugely important, but it's affected not just by the rules that local countries set, but it's also affected by the guidelines that we give in the centres of global capital. And that's why yesterday when we made this announcement about international support for international public support for fossil fuel finance, we also made other announcements the day before that set out, for example, very clearly in the UK, that every listed firm is going to have to disclose the impact of its activities upon the climate by 2023, and also have to set out a plan for how it will align itself with net zero in the years to come. And as we also saw the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is private asset holders, stock market firms, pension funds, and other institutional asset holders, saying that they will align their portfolios with net zero in the years to come. So it's beholden then upon those asset owners to say, we are not going to use the funds in this pension fund to invest in gas in this country or oil in that country. We're going to invest them in renewables in another country or renewables in this country. And so it's not just the local regulations that are important, but also the sort of the framework that you give to institutional investors about where they need to put their money.
Yeah, interesting. And also to note that the infrastructure, many of the times countries have complained there are so many restrictions that come with this kind of support. So looking at the country's policies and regulations and also merging that with, the guidelines that are being brought on board, I think is a very critical, component that countries need to put in place. With that, I want to come to you, Elizabeth, in terms of financing. You've talked about lack of financing, insufficient financing for energy, renewable energy in countries and especially in Africa. So what do you think is the key blocker for Kenya, or rather for Africa? Why is finance not going to where it is supposed to be in Africa? And can the international, stakeholders do more to get finance to the ground? You talked about the issues of energy access at the local level. What is it that needs to be done to ensure that finance reaches the local, the people at the local level?
Thanks, Jacqueline. I think for most countries in the region, access to electricity is still associated with the connection to the national grid. Yet, the decentralized renewable energy options could really play a key role in terms of reaching the last mile communities and also reaching the underserved communities. So in terms of financing, a lot of emphasis has been placed on grid connection, but still the finances are not sufficient because of one, access to these finances has become a challenge, be it in terms of climate finance. You have the fiduciaries associated with that, the processes associated with that is still complex for the developing countries to be able to access these sources of finance. Again, when it comes to planning, most of these countries, the communities that really need this energy are not involved in decision making. But the good news is that there is now integrated planning, whereby different stakeholders are engaged in the process so that whatever energy plans and priorities are being factored have their say in place. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Lucy, you want to add something? No, Okay. So having talked about, Paul talked about Egypt is one of the culprits in terms of, energy, fossil fuels development, and also South Africa. I want to come to you, John, if you allow me. The next COP is coming up in Egypt. What do you think, what can we expect in terms of more countries signing in and coming on board? In your experience, what you foresee? Do you see more countries coming on board before COP27 in Egypt? And would Egypt also, signing into this? What do you think about that?
So thank you. I can't speak about Egypt in terms of what they will commit to, but I can assure you that we will be working the phones and working the conference halls over the next few days and then in the months thereafter, because the UK COP presidency has only just begun. We're actually COP president through till November next year. We'll be working to get other countries to come on board and sign this statement, and I hope to announce a couple more in the next few days, because it's hugely important we make this transition. The technology is moving hugely fast. If you'd have told, for example, people around the continent of Africa or Kenya, where I've worked, that back in 25 years ago that there'd be more phones than people in Kenya by sort of 2010, 2015, people would have laughed. And again, some people laugh at us when we talk about the speed and scale of the transition to renewable energy, and I think they will be surprised. One of the things I think it's really important for us to do is address the role of gas as a transition fuel. I think what we're absolutely not saying is that there is no role for gas under any circumstances. You know, that's not a fair thing to say. And we know that, for example, with Eskom in South Africa and other grids that are already heavily dependent on coal and other forms of fossil fuel, actually there will be a role for some gas in making that transition. But I think it's equally clear that if you're, for example, the DRC or your Malawi or a country that doesn't have that built-up infrastructure for gas already, by the time you build in that infrastructure for gas, it's going to become a stranded asset. And so we need to avoid leading countries down that route of stranded assets and make sure that they're cresting the wave and using the leapfrog technologies. Just as millions of people across Africa never had a fixed line phone and now hold a mobile in their hands, so millions of people across Africa who've never had access to electricity from the grid can have the realistic expectation that in the years to come they'll have electricity either through a rooftop system in their house or through access to a green mini grid. And I think of Kenya, I think of M-KOPA. You know, in about 5 short years, M-KOPA have bought electricity to over 300,000 households in the East African region, all through a profit-based model. And that's hugely exciting, and it can be rolled out. I know it's being rolled out in Ghana. It can be rolled out more widely across the continent. And that has a transformative effect. If I look back at my experience in Eastern DRC, if you've got a conflict-ridden community and you put energy into that community, energy creates jobs, jobs creates wealth, and wealth helps tackle the causes of conflict. So these things can build a virtuous cycle, and it's really exciting.
Okay, before I come to you, Lucille, we have a question from one of our online participants. Please unmute yourself, Laurie, and give your comment or question, please. Please unmute yourself. We can't hear you still. As you try to unmute, allow me to bring in Lucille. Kindly unmute yourself and then we'll come back to you.
Yeah, and actually I just wanted to build on what you said, John, on these exceptional circumstances in which there may be a need for gas. And I think we all recognize that there may exist, and it's important to acknowledge them. And I think it's important that it was also acknowledged in the statement yesterday. But what's even more important is to define very clearly what these exceptions are. And I think that some of the obvious ones are humanitarian crisis, for instance, in which obviously some support may be needed. I think in the context of cooking as well, there may be a need for LPG in some cases to transition then to electric cooking stoves. But the key criteria that I think should be considered is that we should not lock into high carbon, countries into high carbon infrastructures for 40 years. And this is what investments in, for instance, gas power plants may create, and in new gas power plants especially. So I think it's really important to have these criteria really clearly set so that we don't end up having a new dash for gas because we lock into long-lived infrastructure.
Interesting. Thanks for that, Lucille. Please unmute yourself, Laurie, and ask your question. Seems she's having a challenge with unmuting herself. Okay. Have you managed to unmute yourself? Okay, as she tries to, I think the Haiti will help us with that. Allow me to come to you, Promise, in terms of the solutions that you see on the ground in terms of, in Nigeria, in terms of renewable energy and how this corresponds to the nexus between energy and also poverty reduction.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just to add to the conversation.
Please keep it short. Yeah.
Just to add to the conversation, I think for Nigeria, one of the critical things is around clean cooking energy. just about 13% of the entire Nigerian population have access to that. So, I mean, looking at gas right now, it's a huge move away from cutting down trees and using charcoals, right? But looking at what is on ground as regards renewable energy, the Nigerian government has put together a system, an agency to handle that under the Ministry of Power. It's called the Rural Electrification Agency. And basically what they are doing is to implement the 5 million houses energy plan. And that's strictly renewable energy, and so that's a very beautiful move.
Yeah, that's a beautiful move. Allow me to cut you short. We have a question from our online participants. Paul, could you please unmute yourself and ask your question, or rather give your comment? Paul? Yeah, seems we're having a challenge in terms of our online participants. Yeah, so promise, sorry to cut you short. You may, in less than a minute, okay, please conclude.
So the Central Bank of Nigeria also has this framework, which is the framework for implementation of solar connection facility. And this really is a good framework that helps to give a sense of direction for any kind of investments in renewable energy. So for me, these are very good systems that are being put in place for renewable energy in Nigeria.
Oh, great. Yeah. Thanks a lot. So we have less than 10 minutes, and I want to give our panelists 1 minute, less than a minute actually, to give your parting shot in terms of what is your key message on this topic. We start with you, Lucille. I'm looking at you, and then we come to Elizabeth.
Thanks. Well, and first, thank you for all the panelists for the really rich discussion. I think from our discussion, it's quite clear that, you know, this shift from gas to clean renewable alternatives is much needed and is urgent. And the statement that was released yesterday has the potential to deliver, and it's if signatories keep momentum and make sure that other institutions and governments join, and also if there is a bold delivery in terms of avoiding this new gas dash for gas. So really, I think my main message would be a call for governments and institutions to invest in the right alternatives to make sure that you know, the needs of countries in the global south are being met in terms of energy access.
Thank you very much, Lucille. Over to you, Elizabeth. What is your parting shot?
Thank you. I think for me, a clean energy revolution is what is urgently needed for us to be able to fight the fight against energy poverty. And we all know that energy will play a key role in terms of it will be going to be the thread against which the Paris Agreement will be delivered, and also the Sustainable Development Goals. And for us, we are now calling on all governments, all development partners, and with the recent communication that there is going to be an end, sorry, I have a cold, an end, yeah. We are calling for increased investments in terms of clean energy and decentralized renewable energy solutions to be able to reach the communities that are underserved and have them being the first mile communities. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll pass you, Dr. John. Over to you, promise, in less than a minute.
For me, renewable energy is possible in Nigeria. It's already working. It's work in progress. We just need to invest more in that line.
Thank you very much. Paul,
sure.
Less than a minute, please.
Less than a minute.
Yes.
Right. Let's put fossil fuels behind us. Okay. This can be, it's genuinely possible. We can, to put them behind us really quickly. But it's easy also to stay stuck in the old mindset of how, we do big infrastructure projects that, cost $1 billion. And those sorts of things are what international finance organizations like to fund. That's how I'm used to doing business. It's how others in the area are used to doing business. But let's put that model behind us and put our money, our effort, everything we've got into putting renewables to the fore. And it's a genuinely possible thing to be achieved in a very short time frame.
Okay, thank you very much. Over to you, John.
So a couple of words in closing. I say we know that climate change will hit the poorest in the world hardest. We know that the poorest in the world have the least access to energy, and a focus on renewable energy is a way in which we can both tackle climate change and enable energy access for the world's poorest. So we will be pushing other governments to join the pledge that we made yesterday, both in the north, in the global donor community, but also it's really important that countries in the global south stick up their hands and say, actually, we don't want investment in fossil fuels in our country. We see the future is in renewable energy. That's the investment we want, and that will give donor countries the encouragement to join the pledge.
Thank you very much. We have less than 5 minutes left, and just want to give a few closing remarks in terms of what we have been discussing here today. Thank you very much, panelists, for your, sharing your experiences, sharing your thoughts on what needs to happen. Indeed, we are all agreeing that there is need to shift from fossil fuels to renewable energy. There is need to include energy access as a critical component of, decarbonizing the energy sector globally. And it's doable. It has been done somewhere else, and we can do it. And especially for the African countries, it's something that we can do moving forward. And also, more financing is needed. And many thanks to the UK government for taking the lead in terms of, providing that. Yeah, just want to give this 1-2 minutes to any online question from Laurie. Please unmute and give your question. Okay, thank you very much. So we have a question from Laurie to John. I think, John, you can see it. So in terms of the question, how will you define unbated and clearly defined circumstances?
Lucille alluded to a couple of them. One exemption, for example, is in the use of humanitarian situations where it's really important we get power into a humanitarian situation urgently. There are some exclusions for cooking gas, because as Promise has highlighted, the effect of wood collection and charcoal collection can be enormous in terms of deforestation. And then we have set out an exemption for the UK that specifies that if a country has set a net zero commitment and has a greenhouse gas emissions reduction plan that's compliant with a 1.5 degrees C pathway, then we could enable gas power, downstream gas power, as part of that pathway to enable a country with high emissions to make a transition to a low carbon economy. It's just the sort of thing, the work that we're taking forward with ESCOM and other actors in South Africa in order to enable those high emission economies to reduce their emissions down towards zero.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I don't seem to see any more questions from our online participants and also from the panelists here. In case any burning question or comment that anyone of you would like to make in a moment. Okay. I'd like to thank you, all of you panelists, for your great, participation and also sharing your experiences once again in this panel. I also want to thank you, CAFOD, Big Shift, and also Tearfund for organizing and hosting this event. Indeed, it comes at a very opportune moment when we need to shift from from fossil fuels to renewables. And as all of us actually have agreed today, it's doable and we are going to do it. In the next COP27 in Egypt, we'll be talking about a different thing altogether. Hopefully, and that's what each one of us is hoping and looking forward to. So thank you so much to our online participants. Apologies that we are not able to ask your questions as we would have loved, but all in all, we are really grateful that you have been able to join us. Thank you so much, and let's keep moving, and let's not tire to do this. Thank you so much.